Hi everyone, this is Ismail with another video discussing a little bit about art education, which is the main topic of this channel. So I thought today I talk a little bit about some of the framework that goes into an art lesson, especially today in terms of, let's say 10, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, art was taught differently. And what I mean by that is that it wasn't taught with some of the emphasis on rubrics, criteria, vocabulary, and so on. Maybe vocabulary more so than anything, as far as, you know, learning the materials and things like that. But art lessons, let's say in a public school, regardless of grade, we're taught with more freedom in terms of what the art teacher wanted to do. Lesson plans, as far as I know, and I've talked to some very senior veteran art teachers, were still in force. You know, they still had to write their lessons, but there wasn't that emphasis on a lot of the technical aspects of teaching and pedagogical skills that administrators look for. So I think art teachers had more freedom to really express themselves through their teaching and the type of projects that they chose without too much of the, I guess, scrutiny that we face today, which is very different, especially when it comes to art education today. Now, that doesn't mean that scrutiny is a bad thing. I think it's important that a art teacher knows what he or she is doing. But it's important to have now a better understanding of a format or a plan that consists of just more than just the art project in itself. You know, but all the elements that go into a project, or a unit, as it's said more often than not. So I'm going to try to explain to my best ability some of the things you should really look for in your own designing of an art lesson or art project, and what you should have in your lesson to kind of help you not only meet the standards of what a public school or even charter school would want, as far as what administrators hope that you will be able to teach the students, but also in a way to guide students into a better understanding of what and why they're doing this particular art project, and why they have to do these particular exercises or whatever it is that the unit encompasses. That's not. So the first thing usually you should think about is a question. An essential question, they'll usually say, or a main question that kind of frames the project. You could start with something that isn't so, let's say, more general, but then become more specific. You could say, like, what is illustration? You know, as a format to begin a particular lesson, let's say. And I'm just using that as an example. It could be anything. The essential questions, which you can find really a lot of essential questions regarding art projects and so on the internet, but also brainstorm, I would suggest, with other art teachers, or figure out some questions that you need to kind of go over and rephrase and so on. So let's say something like, what is illustration, maybe too general. But you could use that and then break it down and really try to get to a finer point of why you're talking about illustration. For instance, you may be talking about illustration with regard to a particular type of artist that you're going to profile, and then move towards a closer or more defined type of project, you know. one art project that I'm familiar with is one that deals with insects, and in that particular project, um, the, the way I learned it was that there was a particular profile of an artist, looked at his history, look at his artwork, and try to use that as a framework to frame the project that the students would end up doing eventually. And I'm talking in very general terms, but basically what you're trying to do is come up with the reason why this art project is important. And your essential question should kind of uh, bring that to some kind of concise way of thinking. For instance, if you're saying something like, what is illustration? And then you're showing examples of all different types of illustration, then go to an artist that is an illustrator or does some type of illustration, and then pinpoint a particular subject of that illustration. For instance, is it figure drawing? Is it insects, like I mentioned before? Is it about landscapes? You know, illustration covers a lot of different things. So video games and films also have illustration in them. So you can cover a wide range of different subjects to bring a student to, let's say, if you're thinking about landscaping, you could use video games and films as a example of how artists create these particular scenes using landscapes in films that are either animated or realistic, you know, real life type backgrounds, because certain backgrounds are created not just in terms of what's already there, if it's a real life film, but also with the way things are today, where there's a lot of special effects, backgrounds are created in films and so on, and of course in video games. So you could try to use that as a premise, and that's what I'm trying to get at. The second most important thing is choosing an artist that, in a sense, does the kind of work that you're hoping the students will be inspired to do. So if you're using an artist, let's say like Van Gogh, who, let's say, one of the things he's most famous for is portraiture. And your project encompasses that. You know, basically the project is self-portraits, right? Let's say, regardless of the medium, that's what you're choosing. Van Gogh is a perfect example of that. But also, you know, you could say Rembrandt and some of the others who were also well known. And I know Rembrandt was very, did a self-portrait almost, I think, almost most of his life he did self-portraits. A large body of Rembrandt's work is self-portraits. So you could use him, Van Gogh, and probably a couple of others. Frida Kahlo comes to mind because her self-portraits were just simply amazing. And again, now you're talking about an artist, you're giving a little bit of history. You started with your essential question. Now you're talking about a subject in art. Now you're profiling an artist. So basically what you want to do is begin to look at artwork that deals with the subject that you're going to teach. So if it's self-portraits, you should be showing them, right? Classical portraits, either by Van Gogh, if he's your profile artist, or he's the artist you're profiling, sorry, or anybody else. Usually I'll use a number of different artists, regardless if I have a main artist that I'm profiling. I'll still show that, let's say, something like portraits, it's pretty common in the art world in terms of fine art, or even abstract art. You know, portraits don't fall necessarily in a particular bracket, let's say, of art. It doesn't have to, for instance, it doesn't have to look realistic, right? Look at the work of Glenn Close and others like that, who basically, again, are able to show they're doing the same thing, but they're doing it in a very different manner. So you can use that as a format of letting your students know that there is no right or wrong way in doing portraits, even though you might be dealing with a particular medium, and we'll get to that later, where you want the student to kind of really try to develop a certain technique, a certain style, or experience something that's going to help them open them up more to more artistic thinking. Okay, so we are talking about now all these variables that go into a lesson, and one of the things that comes right after that is dealing with the medium. So how do you deal with the medium? Now, depending on the medium, you know, I always like to give a little history on what the medium, or at least technical information. If I talk about Conte, let's say I'm using black and white Conte, or even some of the other colors there, some of the brown Conte, Sinjuin Conte, and all that. If my project is that, if that's the medium I'm using, I always kind of like to give them a little history on who Conte was, because he was an artist himself, and the medium is named after him. So I'll give a little history of that. How is the material actually made? You know, Conte has a combination of charcoal, clay, and some other materials mixed in there. There may be some slight differences in terms of how Conte is made, but I don't really go into that. I just talk about some basic things that Conte is made of, and to give them a reference, and to let them know that this is a material that they can really handle, that it's not too difficult for them to. So after that, you choose your project. You know, it could be anything from geometric shapes to, of course, figure drawing. It could be about landscapes, whatever it is that you want to do. So you need to combine in your lesson a question. You need to be make sure that the question has kind of a general base that goes into something more focused. So I will give more than one essential question. I mean, I'll have one main question, and then I break it down to some other more specific questions. You may want to do that. Profile an artist or artists, plural, in terms of the kind of work you want the students to be exposed to really kind of help them begin to think about what they're going to be doing. Of course, talk to them, you know, introduce to them the project and the medium in which they're going to be doing this project. So, you know, if it's graphite, again, going back to the whole thing of using mediums. I did a previous video where I talk about all the various mediums, and you should look at that and on this channel. And I have a prolific of books that deal with various mediums, how they're made and where they come from and so on. And I think it's important, if you're an art teacher, to please make sure you're developing a collection of books. It's really, really important. That's for another day. So anyway, going back to this. So you have your project, you have your medium. Now you need to have criteria. So for instance, now there's two types of assessing students. There's formative assessment, and there's there's formative assessment, and then there's summative assessment. And basically, formative assessment is basically criteria-less, going, you know, from the beginning of the project to the end. They're basically questions to help the student assess where they are in their work. That could deal with self-assessment and peer assessment, which is also something you should incorporate. So you'll have criteria, drawing criteria. And a drawing criteria could be anything from, with basic questions, asking the student how far have they basically drawn lightly, if it's a drawing exercise, how accurate they drew, did they put all the elements that were included in the project. You know, that could be anything from you know, the background, the foreground, the middle ground, that type of thing. Did they compose or create a composition that had particular elements? Let's say you're teaching symmetry or asymmetry, asymmetry. So those are the types of things that you want to cover in your criteria. And you can have several criteria. So you can have a criteria for the beginning of your project where the students are, you know, you can ask them questions again. What are they doing basically, or how are they going about handling the material? That's one. Two, you can ask, let's say they go further along in the project and now you want to do a peer assessment where another student will assess the work of a particular student. Let's say student A is going to assess the work of student B, and you'll have a list of questions and turn and talk type of practice where they talk to each other, or one assesses the other but then gives them positive feedback regarding their work. Things to help them improve the work, things that they like about the work, and so on and so forth. Now, formative assessment can come in different ways, different shapes. That's really up to you as a teacher. Now, when we come to summative assessment, basically that is the rubric in a sense. Now, the summative assessment can be made through you talking with your students, actually asking them a question. What should this work contain? You can start out with a question that starts with, what details should my self-portrait have? You know, and what you're asking the student is to come up, or the students, to brainstorm. Well, what makes a good self-portrait? And they'll come up with a lot of different ideas. You could use that as a framework to begin to build on a rubric that they will have ownership over. And that's really, really important, because if they do have ownership over the rubric, they could see, oh, well, this is what a 4 would be as compared to a 1 or a 2. This is what a 3 would be, you know, so on. Don't make rubrics too big or too complicated. Make them where you're dealing with particular aspects of the work. For instance, if you are using color, are they blending colors correctly? Are they drawing accurately enough? You know, that could be another part of the rubric. So you have these different parts of your rubric that explain more or less what the work should contain. You know, you can have a part where you grade about, for instance, what are you going to grade on? You're going to grade composition. You're going to grade on the overall work. Craftsmanship is a part of that. So you're going to come up with various variables that you want the students to keep in mind as they're working on their project. So for that to happen, you need to have a concise, clear rubric that's written in their language. Remember what I just said, in their language. Because what happens most of the time, if you're too technical and you're using, I mean, I work with middle school students, so I can't use language that's, let's say, for a high school student or a college student, and expect my sixth graders to understand, you know, a sophisticated word that really they don't use in their vocabulary at this point in time, so in their lives. So I would try to really find a word that's a little bit more up to their level, but also that they understand clearly. So be careful with the wording of your criteria, regardless of what criteria list you use for your project, throughout your project. Also be aware of your rubric and what are the specific words you're looking at. Now, I've covered a couple little different things in this video, but I want you to also be aware of the fact that, you know, you need to target certain things and in an art project. So what are the students learning? You know, That would probably go into your lesson planning, you know, and you need to have that because if an administrator comes in and wants to know, well, what are they learning specifically? You need to kind of find a way to explain that. So if you don't understand it for yourself, chances are your students will not understand it either. So it's important to really look at what you're going to teach and be really specific in terms of why do they need to know this. Now, of course, you're teaching artistic skills, drawing, painting, what have you, you know. But there's a reason to learn those things. And regardless of where they go in life, I believe drawing is an enormous, important skill. So for them, you know, you need to find a reason why that's important. You need to ask yourself, well, why is it important? Well, what does it do to them creatively? You know, does it help them think critically? Does it help them in their planning of whatever they're doing? You know, they could be designing a piece of furniture, let's say, or anything. So learning how to draw and sketch is important for that. It expands their view of the world, you know. So but in terms of a question like that or an answer like that, you need to then break that down and again be as specific as possible. You don't have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to criteria and rubrics, particularly if you're doing a lesson that has been done by many other teachers. Try to really find out also where to get resources and where to look. The internet is full of rubrics, examples. Facebook has a wonderful number of groups of art teachers from all different grades, elementary, middle school, high school, that all talk to one another, share ideas. So there's a lot of resources if you can't find those resources in your school specifically. So I think it's really important that you have essential question, criteria, formative, of course, and summative assessment, which criteria falls under formative. Have a profile, an artist or several artists, and have vocabulary also that will challenge their understanding, because I'll give you a good example. If you use a word like texture, let's say you're teaching the word texture, as it relates to art, the students will talk about texture as it relates to their own experience, right? So they know that it's about feeling something that could be rough or whatever. But in art, it could also be something visually. So something that looks shiny, something that looks rugged, something that looks, and you know, all the different ideas that texture can come up with in terms of what you're able to see. Of course, there's art that you can feel, but again, this is a word that has various meanings in terms of real life application and the way we look at art. So you need to be able to tell students the difference in that way. So vocabulary is very key in terms of artistic understanding. So I hope that helps. I mean, I kind of went everywhere with this video, but I wanted to really cover those basic ideas. Down in the comment section, I put down basically a basic list of what your lessons should contain. So look down there, and that'll help you kind of get through this video. Hopefully I explained a couple of good ideas in that sense. If you found this video interesting and you liked it, please click the like button down, and also if you want to see more videos that deal with art education and different subjects in art education, please subscribe. So thank you again and have a great day.